Welcome back, everyone, to El Nino Speaks. I'm your host, Jose Nino. And tonight I have Kurt from Antelope Hill talk about a very interesting book that I was just reading the other day. The book in question is Richard Walther Darré's The Peasantry as the Lifeblood of the Nordic Race. So, before we start, could you give a brief background of who Walther Darré is and his overall like body of work during his time serving as a functionary for the National Socialist regime in Germany?
Sure, and thanks for having me on. I guess as far as I recall of his sort of biographical details, he was born actually to Germans living in Argentina, which accounts for his slightly less than typical name for a German. He grew up there for some time, ended up moving back to Germany, and went to school for agricultural science, basically, and remained in that field for most of his life. I'm not sure exactly when he joined the party or began his association with them, but he ascended to a pretty prominent position as part of actually the SS eventually, who had a department that was dedicated to the study of agricultural and settlement issues. This was sort of the office that would be conducting research on settlement both of agricultural colonies within Germany as well as general issues pertaining to Germany's farming population, and also to basically studies of how they might settle their newly acquired eastern territories as the war developed in that direction.
And what was his official title in the National Socialist regime? If I'm not mistaken, he was like a minister of agriculture.
So he was Reich Minister for Food and Agriculture, in addition to his position with the SS as head of the Race and Settlement Office. So kind of a couple of different points in his portfolio, but that was his general area of responsibility.
I see. Was he, because like when we talk about food and agriculture, and also and this ties into the book as well, because this book is very anthropological focused. Was he involved in any type of eugenics programs throughout the National Socialist regime?
I don't believe he had any personal involvement in sort of what most people would think of as the eugenics programs, or at least not in negative eugenics, as in the prevention of reproduction by those perceived as undesirable. I think his focus was more on how to create positive growth within German society, and that was mostly through the lens of his research into sort of what the title says, the way in which the peasant class, the farming or rural class, really does provide the sort of social and moral backbone of a country. He had seen, of course, and he writes about quite a bit in the book, the way that several factors combined in Imperial Germany from 1871 to 1918 that had really sort of torn the heart out of German society and displaced a lot of that class into the cities. Primarily, of course, that was the huge industrial boom that took place in Germany between those years. The rise of the Rhineland as a global manufacturing hub, and also the rise of more technical education fields. Of course, Germany would become the world leader in chemistry and all sorts of other practical sciences. And this had devastated a population that was already suffering under a lot of other pressures.
So you mentioned peasantry there, that one of the major themes that I was able to glean from reading this book is his Darré's championing of like the peasantry, because in modern parlance, anything that's like reference to like peasants or peasantry has a negative connotation. But based on Darré's analysis in this book, which is actually quite like multidisciplinary in nature, he uses biology, history, archaeology, even like animal breeding and some philosophy to kind of like justify that the peasantry are actually like the backbone of like highly functional and prosperous Nordic races. And how does Darré come to that conclusion that having a solid peasant class leads to a higher civilization?
Sure. So I'll kind of take that question from the start. And of course, you're right that the word peasantry has a decidedly negative connotation. Of course, in the original German, the word peasantry is not used. It's the German term would be Bauerntum, which is closer literally to, I suppose you could say, farmerdom, the social class that derives its wealth from the land. And that is really what he's describing. It's more about the relationship to the land, because of course peasant conjures up sort of the Monty Python medieval peasants digging in filth sort of stereotype. But that's not what Darré is discussing at all. Even the sort of wealthier classes, the wealthier rural classes, that is, are considered peasantry in this sort of narrative that he's weaving. Primarily, he's contesting a notion that had become very popular at the time, that a lot of people will be sort of incidentally familiar with, that the Nordic or Aryan or Indo-European peoples, however one might choose to refer to them, had descended originally from essentially a nomadic warrior class, and that they were properly understood as he literally uses the word Herrenvolk, or master race, a term that everyone has heard, that is not fit for manual labor, but rather purely for conquest and domination of others who would do the sort of drudgery of basic production. Darré is very much pushing back against that, and he's asserting, to the contrary, that the Nordic race, those European peoples, have always consisted primarily of a class of people who drew wealth from the land, who were brave warriors, but not nomads, not simply fighting nobility, but productive nobility. And that class being at the core of a civilization, or a culture, rather, is what allows all other productive work to be done. And he provides sort of the negative counterexample of truly nomadic peoples, especially the Arabs and the Tatars of the Russian steppe, and notes that these peoples don't really produce, or they don't create productive societies in the way that Nordic peoples have done everywhere they've gone in the world. And therefore, there must be a fundamental difference in nature between them, right? And it's sort of on that basis that he identifies that peasant culture as ultimately the thing that sets the Nordic peoples apart and sort of makes them superior in the ways that they are superior.
That's one theme I was able to gather rather quickly when he mentioned the nomadic races, such as, like, as you mentioned, like the Tatars and even like Arabs. But as time progressed, what does this kind of like nomadic protoculture generally lead to, according to Darré's analysis?
Well, of course, he basically argues that what these nomadic peoples are basically good at is simply stripping the land of any resources, and moving on, and that's sort of the behavior that they classically exhibit. Of course, it would be out of place to ignore in his analysis his identification of the Jews as another nomadic people. That's sort of central to his discourse on more modern times, that coming from their Semitic background, like the Arabs, like all sort of desert peoples, there's a fundamental disalignment between them and the productive or peasant peoples. And those two words basically become synonymous. Peasants are productive, nomads are destructive.
Interesting. does he make a distinction between like the nomadic peoples of like say like Arabs and Tatars from Jews, or does he lump them all like together more or less?
Goes into some amount of detail on this, but not really. I think essentially the Jews are the more sophisticated of these groups and have sort of transplanted a nomadic worldview into the midst of a productive one. That's sort of the fundamental distinction is merely the way in which their trade is plied, so to speak. The Tatars might make or have made these grand slave raids into Russia and Poland and carried off the wealth of the nation, quite literally carried it off. Um, Whereas, for example, the Jews are a little bit less obvious, perhaps, in the way that they might exploit a population or its wealth or those sorts of things. But fundamentally, they're characterized by the same nomadic tendencies, I think would be his argument.
Yes. So in this equation, because you previously brought up the point of like the industrialization, because Darré was writing against the backdrop of like a time when countries across the West, from the United States all the way to Germany, were going through profound socioeconomic transformations that were brought about by mass industrialization, which inevitably led to the displacement of numerous people in the countryside. In his framework, does Darré view the capitalist process as also like a kind of a nomadic type of system that benefits like more of these like nomadic tribes, or how does capitalism fit into this equation?
Well, I think capitalism, well, I suppose it's a bit of a complex answer because the issues that he would take with capitalism would primarily relate to its lack of social responsibility, which is a fundamental point in sort of traditional Germanic law and custom, and one that grows out of its peasant nature. And of course, financialization generally, he argues, is wrong. There are certain things that need to be kept in check. He contrasts, for example, the way that German law requires a sort of fundamental dignity and fairness and social responsibility with the way that Roman law concerns only sort of the individual and what he can take. So the sort of the way that capitalism rewards unrestricted greed and avarice, he would argue, definitely fits into the nomadic plunder economy. Uh, After all, it's many people have said the global capitalist class are essentially nomads. They don't belong to a place. They're not rooted. They don't derive anything from the land, even in the most abstracted sense. Right? They're simply rent seekers on a global scale.
I see. Would you say that when looking at Darré's like assessment of Bolshevism and communism, that there is like a more direct line from this nomadic ethos to Bolshevism?
Oh, he certainly thinks so. I mean, he connects the evolving nature of Bolshevism very explicitly with Russia's sort of nomadic tendencies. And I don't think he means to demean the Russian people specifically in that, but of course, Russia has the legacy of the Mongols and the Tatars and other groups, and that influence sort of bleeds into it. He calls Lenin a Tatar at multiple points, which I think is true. I think he was half or a quarter descended from one of the Russian Central Asian tribes.
So in his time in the German government from the 1930s to the early 40s, what was his main challenge in terms of trying to deal with like the the reality of a modern day capitalist economy, what was he mostly tasked with trying to make those like adjustments? Like what was his main role?
Well, in terms of dealing with reforming a capitalist economy, I think that was a little bit outside of his portfolio. That was mostly left up to the the economist, because Darré was not trained specifically as an economist. There were, of course, plenty of National Socialist economists who did make it their mission to really reform a system that had been based on rampant financialization and usury, and that's sort of a whole other story on its own. But he did partake in some reform efforts that were geared more towards his area of expertise, towards agriculture and agricultural policy. One of the big ones was reforming the law that had existed under the German Civil Code that had been promulgated under the Empire, and that code had basically erased the distinction between personal property and real property, as in land. Under that system, land could be disposed of freely, it could be mortgaged, it could be divided, and this had resulted over time in the diminishment of family farming across Germany. As might be somewhat obvious, when you can put a farm up for mortgage, well, then you have actually what also happened in the United States over the past several decades, where the habitual indebtedness of small farms simply results in them being mortgaged, taken over by banks, repackaged, and sold to larger conglomerate farms. He obviously viewed this as a bad thing, and so part of the legal reform was in getting rid of that. The farms could no longer be seized by creditors. The other thing was they changed the way that the inheritance worked. I forget the German term for it off the top of my head, but essentially, previously, the inheritance in the family farm could be divided just like any other property, right? So the farmer's will might say you might have 4 children and leave a quarter of it to all of them. That results over time in parcels that are too small to actually sustain themselves or turn a profit. They're simply not worth working, and so they end up being sold off. So this law was changed under Darré's influence to basically make that impossible. The smaller family farms had to remain in one lot, had to be inherited by one heir, could no longer be divided. If by dividing it, the viability of it would be threatened.
What were Darré's critiques of like the previous imperial German system in terms of agricultural policy?
Well, I think I've touched on it a bit already, but in addition to sort of what we've already been over with the way that the civil code operated to harm farming and the way that sort of unchecked industrialization may have harmed it as well, there was an overall sort of just lack of care towards agriculture generally. I think the imperial state was mostly fixated on the way that financial services and heavy industry and these cutting edge sciences would increase their own power abroad. The issue of agriculture had sort of fallen away. Even under Bismarck, some care was given to it. They had protectionist policies for agricultural goods, for example, and those were sort of gradually removed. Except I believe in Prussia they maintained some of them east of the Elbe. But in general, they suffered greatly from a simple neglect, really.
I see. I see one thing that I'm gathering in this conversation and also in the book that I noticed as well is Darré, he doesn't like like as you said, he doesn't like the idea of creditors taking over land. Was this a common view among National Socialist policymakers that of viewing the creditor in a more skeptical light as opposed to say like a someone that is engaged in production or tilling or harvesting of the land?
Oh, absolutely, and I think that's not even uncommon at other times and places. You could even look at certain developments in the United States during the Depression. The seizure of family farms by creditors was hated. I mean, and of course, who would be in favor of it in those circumstances? Of course, but in general, yes, sort of financial work was not really seen as legitimate in many circumstances. There was, of course, the famous National Socialist economist whose name I cannot recall, but he wrote on the abolition of debt slavery that was very influential. Private loan capital in general was seen as a huge issue because, of course, the simple mathematical logic of it is that loan capital being in private hands like that, used only to enrich the lender, gradually over time is going to result in a greater and greater agglomeration of wealth in the hands of a few people, as has predictably happened in the United States at this point with BlackRock and Vanguard and all that. So we can see where the development was heading and why they tried to head it off.
Also, going back to some of Darré's background, because as you said before, he was from Argentina. And were there any intellectuals or policymakers that had a disproportionate influence on his vision for agricultural policy?
But there's quite a few that he cites. I'm not sure I could recall the names of any one of them specifically, but there was a whole community of German agricultural scientists who were involved in answering these kinds of questions. Did you have one in mind that stuck out to you particularly from the book?
No, not necessarily, because I haven't delved that deep into it. I mean, one thing too I noticed as well, like there's tons of footnotes in this book, and it can go into numerous side quests. And that's one thing I found fascinating about it, was it's very well researched and documented, and it's not a polemic whatsoever. It combines like a lot of disciplines and looks at like agricultural policy from like the start of basic human civilization. But no, I was just wondering, because when you look at like the 20th century, especially the first half of it, you did start to see the people begin to question not only capitalism but also the train wreck that was Bolshevik communism. So I figured that Darré would probably have drawn back from like traditions of, say, like even like Friedrich List in the 19th century. But I was just curious to see if he drew inspiration from similar figures.
I can't remember off the top of my head any reference to List, but it's possible. There's definitely, at least in the earlier part of the book, and what I found the most interesting to read was how many people he was disagreeing with in this book. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying at the start about contesting the view of Nordic or Aryan or Indo-European nomadism. He's really heavily contesting that, which had, as I said, become sort of a popular theory. And that's very interesting to me because, of course, around this time and in connection with the increase in industrialization and the need for skilled workers and researchers, there had, of course, been the explosion in sort of practical universities, right? The classic state agriculture and mining school. And of course, the ones in the United States are basically modeled after the ones that the Germans were producing around this time. And so you had this huge glut of researchers, all with their own pet theories, trying to fit round pegs into square holes and come up with new interpretations of prehistory, which it makes this kind of discourse very easy to attack from the left, because there are a lot of thinkers and writers from this time period who really don't provide the receipts and mostly are just theory crafting. Darré, I think, is notable for being one of the few who engages with this subject matter that's actually still worth reading and hasn't been completely disproven.
With respect to critics, who was Darré most critical of when he was writing this book?
Oh, I wrote down. Hang on, what was the guy's name? I think it was Kern, guy named Kern, who had basically proposed that the German people were made up of like two different or distinct races. That they had a kind of warrior nobility at the top and a peasant class at the bottom that did all the grunt work, and really made every effort to sort of divide German culture into those two parts. And Darré very strongly pushed back against this, of course, and proposed instead a sort of fundamental unity around the productive peasantry.
With regards to public policy, Darré, as you called attention to, crafted a law on land, like farmland inheritance. Were there any
Right.
other landmark policies that he was responsible for implementing?
And that was the big one, and that was called. It just came back to me. That was the Reichserbhofgesetz, the realm ancestral home law, essentially. That was definitely the big one that he pushed for. Do you remember if there was mention of any other major ones?
I think I saw something that roughly translated into the national food estate or something like that. It's like Reichsnährstand.
Oh yeah, okay. What? Yes, I don't remember exactly what that one concerned, but you're correct. I do recall reading a little bit about this.
Yeah, it's like a policy where they would control all facets of like food production and distribution. Yeah, just looking at this. But yeah.
Oh yeah, just sort of a regulatory body, right?
Yeah.
And that makes sense. And it's kind of organized around, well, he talks earlier about the importance of like the guild system in regulating production. I think it was sort of modeled off of that kind of idea. And also likely off of experiences during the First World War and thereafter with food shortages and that type of thing.
So this is more like broadly speaking about like the political economy, because there's a lot of misconceptions in like the discourse you read about National Socialist Germany. On one hand, you'll see leftists say that, oh, National Socialist Germany was just this rapacious, hard right capitalist system. And then you'll have people, even on like the ostensive, like conservative or Anglo-American right, say that National Socialist Germany was just like another form of tyrannical collectivism that was no different from the Soviet Union. And from what I could gather here is that National Socialist Germany, when you look at the actual facts, it actually was like a third way, because as we've like discussed here, there is like some degree of private property rights protection. And was Darré generally averse to some of like the full-blown collectivization of agriculture that you saw implemented in the Soviet Union?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, their policy was frankly the exact opposite of collectivization. If you look at the way that capitalism, the introduction of a capitalist system affects agriculture, it essentially accomplishes the same thing by a different route as communist collectivization. It pushes all the lands into the hands of one central authority and dispossesses the farmers and basically converts them over into tenant farmers. That's what has happened in most of the United States at this point with agricultural giants like Monsanto. The only difference is on paper, and it's that Monsanto isn't officially speaking an arm of the government. I think when people on the so-called left or right, and I really think that these terms are basically meaningless
Yes.
polemical tools. when those people say these kinds of things about the National Socialist policies, they're not saying it because they're arguing with you. They're saying it because they don't know any better and they want to beat the other side over the head with the Nazi club. That's about it. I mean, if people really go and read the policies that they were introducing and the way that these things worked, people can gain an actual understanding of it. And which, of course, is why we publish these things. The policies that Darré was introducing, no, they were not free market capitalist, and there will be some ANCAPs and some hardcore American conservatives who take issue with that for various reasons. But at the end of the day, these were calculated and directed towards preserving the property of a free German peasant class. They were protecting the rights of that class of people. If there are anarcho-capitalists out there who want to say that that's bad because it interferes with the invisible hand of the free market and that that's basically an insult to God, those people are entitled to their opinions, of course. But it's a far cry from the Soviet Bolshevism that dispossessed that class of people. And of course, in the Soviet Union, it was specifically the more prosperous private farmers, the actual landowners, the kulaks, who got the worst of collectivization. That was the same class in Germany that Darré was trying to protect. So absolutely opposite policies.
Now, going more towards the end of Darré's career as a functionary for the National Socialist state, did Germany's entry into like World War II ultimately lead him to leaving his role? What caused him to no longer serve as the minister of agricultural and land policy?
Oh, he served up until the end of the war. He was arrested by, I think, the American military and thrown in a camp. Was tried just like all of the other higher officers in the German government. So yeah, I mean, the war caused no issue for him. In fact, especially if you read some of the earlier parts of the book where he talks about sort of reclaiming older German homelands. Much of that territory had, of course, passed to Poland in the aftermath of the First World War. I would guess, I don't recall anything specifically on this, I would guess that he was overjoyed at the expansion to the east. And of course, he played a role in some of the planning for settlement of certain eastern territories as well.
After he was captured, was Darré like imprisoned, or what type of punishment did he face, and what was like the later like stages of his life like?
As far as I recall, he basically retired to private life. He served a few years in one of the prisons that were set up in the aftermath of the war. I don't recall when exactly he died, but I don't think he lived very long after the end of the war.
I see.
Oh, so, you know what though? I recalled something. So you had referenced him being dismissed as from his office in the SS. That was true. He was dismissed from his office in the SS, but I believe he still held his government office throughout the time period.
Okay, yeah, like the Minister of like Food and Agriculture. Okay, I see.
I believe that's the case. He had some conflict with Himmler, who appointed some other guys, probably some less intelligent guys, into the SS part of that, and that contributed substantially to sort of the government and the SS having some fundamental disagreements on how to handle the Eastern Territories, which was a constant feud that they had. You know, couldn't even wait until the end of the war, which was very unhelpful for them. But yeah.
What prompted Antelope Hill to translate Darré's work? Why do you think this text is like still relevant in the present?
Well, the first thing, of course, is simply that we found it interesting, and that no competent translations have, to our knowledge, ever been attempted into English. That, of course, being our primary criteria. But I do think that there is an ongoing debate about sort of the nature of our people and the proper steps that have to be taken to sort of restore it to a better condition. And especially in some circles, there's this sort of worship of warfare and nomadism that's disconnected from a kind of blood and soil view, which is the one that we adhere to. You know, coming from people like, let's say, Bronze Age pervert, for an example, Darré would despise him for the kinds of things that he promotes. So I think that Darré's views are helpful to people who are trying to figure out how they see a better future emerging, and that's its relevance for today.
Well, I really enjoyed this conversation, Kurt, and I strongly recommend all listeners also check this book out. Even though I haven't finished it, I think it's one of like the more engaging reads just because of like the wealth of information that's provided here and also some like the reference points because it's not just a contemporary uh political work, but it draws from stuff that goes all the way back to antiquity and like the formations of like states. And before we wrap up, Kurt, where can listeners get the book and how can they support your work and Antelope Hill Publishing?
Yeah, so we sell everything through our own website. It's antelopehillpublishing.com. We do all our own shipping and everything. No need to go through Amazon and give your money to Bezos. We do have social media that you can follow. We're on X, Twitter. We're on a couple other places as well. And we do also have a new book out recently, Greatness and Ruin by Ricardo Duquesne, which is maybe a little bit similar to this book that we discussed in terms of its philosophical examinations, sort of leaving out the focus on agriculture and peasantry. But if you liked this discussion, you might like that book as well.
Great stuff. Again, thank you for coming on to the show, Kurt. And to the audience, thank you all for tuning in. And with that, El Nino has spoken.